Hello everyone, I'm Ron Lemon, and this is Level Up with Lemonade, Episode 3. In this episode, we're going to briefly look at foreshortening the armature. I sort of forgot that in the last episode, and I'd like to touch briefly upon that before we move on. We're also going to look at dividing the limbs so that when you're ready to apply the muscles, it's a much easier thing to do. The meat of this episode is looking at the actual skeleton now and fitting it into the armature and how it nicely fits within and how certain parts of it extrude outside of it. And I almost forgot, we have drawing reviews from the Discord channel, so look out for that towards the end of the video as well. There's also a bonus chapter in this episode, but I'm going to leave that topic a mystery for you to go watch. All right, let's get into it. Moving beyond the standing figure, this is where we want to start. We want to begin with a standing figure, all the body parts at length. We can see everything very clearly because we need to learn how to measure the length versus the width and so forth. We then start to venture into other poses, and since we're going to be doing illustrations, storyboards, etc., we're going to be doing daily activities that most people do. Nothing too extreme. Sitting isn't extreme and people do it, but we have to sometimes draw the seated person facing towards us. I have one visual example here of somebody seated facing forward towards us, and it just so happens that their arms are also foreshortened, and this is a great place to think about how does perspective fit into all of this? How does foreshortening work? How do we do a seated pose? Several different things overlapping at the same time. With the tool set that we have, this Armature tool set, we've learned that there's 3 sections in the torso between the pillow shape and then the head and the neck. Each one of these fits into a nice little measure, and once we start doing individual likenesses and caricatures and concept character designs, we can change these proportions to help get a more fitting or more well-suited body type or length and height of a certain character type. We rely upon these organized numbers in the beginning, these organized units of measure, to help us come up with a standard. That way, for every pose that we draw, we can begin with that standard, then make adjustments from there. In the pose that we have of her sitting, I'm going to begin with the shoulder line. And then I'm going to think about which side of the pose is more active than the other to give one side an extended line versus the other side giving it a bent line. Now, the reason the extended line exists for a forward-facing pose or a pose that's facing away from us, but we're still seeing across the width of the person, is that one side, maybe the arm is up. And if the arm goes up, then all of the muscles on this side of the body react to it that way. They stretch. They don't stay complacent. They actually change. And in this case, we have an arm that's up. We have an arm that's down. And so I'm giving this side the more active, stretched side, where this side has more compression to it for that very reason. And then I'm going to look for the head and the neck, and that way the entire core of the pose is placed. And then I can begin working out the nuances of perspective. So having the head in there, having the torso in there, showing that one side is more active than the other, I can now start to think about elevation of pieces and how parts of the body are reacting to the actions. In a seated position, the legs are not directly under the figure. They're facing towards us. The muscles of the leg start in the pelvis. Our pelvis is somewhere right around here at its height. And then those muscles extend down into the leg from the top of the pelvis. So it's fitting then to draw the legs within the pillow shape, which is where they should be. And this is a common mistake that I see, people drawing the legs under the pillow. What you're doing by drawing them under the pillow is you're adding an additional head unit of length to the overall torso, making them look too tall. So we want to avoid that, and we want to place the ellipses within the figure. Now, we don't know how these are facing as of yet, because we don't have any ellipses within the figure. The ellipses within the figure, one of them is easy to see because I'm using the top line of the bottoms that she's wearing, and the curvature is going around the body like this in the portion that's visible, which means that if we continue that all the way around, our lower ellipse to the pelvis is going to be in this direction. And that also makes sense because the pelvis is tilted downward while the rib cage is tilted upward. The line that's going to be drawn up in here is going to be facing upward. But I don't want it just to be an arc. I want to make sure that it becomes an ellipse. We are trying to draw something with dimension to it. These ellipses are acting as our perspective tool for the moment, but we'll have a few more tools added that gives us additional perspective visually. Her shoulders are facing towards us, her hips are facing away from us. So I'm placing a marker at both ends, and that then means I have to connect the dots together, and this is going to be an S-curve. The majority of poses that you're going to see people do have an S-curve center line to them. C-curves are also fairly frequent, especially when you're at an odd angle to the person. Straight lines are really only for a very stock and standard pose, so you're not going to see those as often. The S-curve, though, is going to be seen more frequently than most because it relates the shoulders and the hips to each other. Her right shoulder is out in front of her right hip. Her left shoulder is behind her left hip. And that's going to force a center line to spiral, to become an S-curve because of the position that both of those arms are in related to one another. And both of the legs are going to be facing forward, but in this particular direction because of that S-curve. Now, as I showed last time, the legs don't want to be drawn from the center line. They want to be pulled in a little bit. The pelvis shape is something like this. And when we get used to building this within the armature, we'll then have a better point of reference for where the width of the leg should be. So it's not uncommon to be drawing the figures with the legs started like this for quite a while until you know better, until you know those points of measure better. Now the next thing I need to do is determine where the knees are. Now there's a visual way to do this. And in the visual way, what I'm looking at is the knee here is roughly right around where the navel is. And the navel is usually close to halfway through the middle of the pillow shape. Maybe I should raise it up just a little bit more. And then I'm going to connect the two ellipses together. And I also want to make sure that the ellipse that's back here is firmly connected to the pillow shape. And I don't have these really awkward angles that sit away from it. We're not looking for muscle mass. We're looking for how the skeleton is placed within this container. And the skeleton is much smaller than all the muscle mass. This big curve that's over here in the photograph is not going to be drawn in. In fact, I can maybe narrow this up a little bit more and remove this edge over here so it doesn't give the impression at all that that's what I'm trying to do. I'm also going to move the center line over slightly because the S-curve that's in this pose is a very subtle one and I've made it a little too extreme. That's my action illustration side of me, pushing things a little bit more. And to address that for just a moment, we here, try to draw the poses as dynamically as possible. And so we push them beyond what we're seeing because we think that that word dynamic means to make the pose even more exciting. The reality is, if you find all these subtleties that I'm designing into, you will have a more extreme pose. Our tendency is to make poses fairly stiff, and this is helping avoid that stiffness. So the other knee is lower than the first one I drew, but it's also extended off to the side of the body. It's no longer within the container space, it's over off to the side of it. And in fact, I can move it over just a little bit more, and I could probably move this one over a little more as well, putting them both even further to the left. Then from there, the heel of this foot is roughly a head unit of measure, maybe even a head and a quarter from the underside of her body. So I'm looking at the height of this, and I'm judging the height of this distance down here, and then a little more. And so the heel will probably be somewhere right around here, or at least at this elevation. I'm going to extend the lower leg down, and that too is directly in the center of the figure. So I've already pushed it too far. I'm going to move it over a little bit. And notice how I drew the new one before I'm erasing the old one. If we eliminate the old mistake, we're likely to repeat it again. I leave the mistake in the drawing and fix the drawing, then remove the mistake. That way I know for a fact that I've actually done my job. By keeping the other one in there and seeing the new result, I have something to compare them to before I wipe the slate clean, only to find I'm probably going to repeat myself again. The bottom of this foot has a bend in the toes, and then the ankles are here, which gives me the rest of the door wedge shape. And I'm going to extend or elevate the toes as well. The other leg is out in front. I'll bring it out this way. And I'm looking at the negative space between here, making sure that I don't push the ankles too far from one another. This ankle, though, is lower, and I'm going to run a horizontal line in my mind, but across the page, it's just above the box line, but it's also cutting through the midpoint of the foot, this right along in here. So the heel of this foot is going to be somewhere in line with the center of the top plane of the other foot. Then not making the arch of the foot at all, and then finding the toes, which I can better draw once I have a floor plane in place. Do the draw through, build the elevation, and now all we have left are the arms to block in. Now again, this is eyeballing the information as opposed to measuring it out. Measuring it out is another thing altogether, but there's a useful tool that we can work with, which I'll get to here in just a moment. The elbow. The hand is roughly right around where the mouth is, so the hand will be somewhere around in here. This hand is, I'm looking at it in relationship to the top of the shoulder, that I do need to lower and move over to the left a little bit more. The hand is somewhere right around in here. And the forearm is very foreshortened over here. All right, now that the entire figure is in place, I want to go back in and I want to plot the floor plane. Now, some of you might put the floor plane in first, and then you're going to have a hard time getting everything to fit. What I usually recommend for the floor plane is to put it in once you see the big picture in place. And what you're doing with the floor plane is you're making adjustments to your drawing, as we should, right? We start off with an idea, but then we do need to fine tune that idea with whatever tool set we can. And the floor plane is that fine tuning tool. I don't know if this box is sitting on the ground plane properly because I don't have a ground plane in place. The horizon line is going to be somewhere right around here. And since her hands are here and here, and we have the box to contend with, the center of the photo is running along her center line. So the vanishing point will be right here, and then I'll extend 2 measuring lines from that vanishing line, making sure that I encompass the arm that's up as well as the body. And there's my floor plane. I'm going to make a few marks on it because, again, we do want this to be a measuring tool. I'll move those over. I'm not going to use this one or this one, but I still leave them in there anyway. Connect the dots. Then finding the intersection for each of these lines. I'll block in the horizontals. And now we have a grid, which I didn't put on its own layer. Usually I would do that, and I didn't this time. And that's okay because this is going to end when the armature is finished. I'm not going to be developing this any further. But if it was going to be developed further, then I would definitely need to redo the floor plane so that they stay disconnected from each other. Now this leg looks a little more elevated than it should be. And it's because I have this too low. I'm going to lift this up and I'm going to lower this just a tiny bit. Then I'm going to erase the old base. And things are getting a little bit closer. Now also keep in mind that the muscle mass has been removed, so the bones may look a little bit more extreme without those muscles to balance things out. And that is just something that you have to get used to in your own drawing because you're building things in stages. The model doesn't change for each of our stages. The model is the way that they are. And in this case, the way she is. And we can't expect that we can just, remove muscles and go, oh, well, that's how big the figure really is. This is translating what we see from life. There's always going to be some kind of 10 to 20% room for error in the very beginning. Once you understand what you're doing, I would even say for the professional, that number doesn't really change, because we're second guessing everything in the very beginning. We're not totally clear where we're going with things. And that's totally fine. Error is part of success. And by seeing something out of place, you're going to make an improvement on it regardless. It's okay to make the mistake. Leave it in. Utilize it as part of the work routine, part of the workflow, and you'll end up with a much stronger pose in the end. Now, this is all eyeballing. And eyeballing is not necessarily vanishing points and horizon lines and all of that. That was for the camera, so that we know where we are in elevation to the model. And in fact, I need to come back through here and make sure that that box is grounded, make sure that the toes are grounded, probably pull these back a little bit, and really make sure that that part of the foot feels like it's planted firmly on the floor plane. And by doing that, I'll have a more successful sketch as a result of it. Now, the next thing I would do, which I'm not going to have time for here, is I would go back over the whole drawing on another layer and remove the noise so that I have a very clear armature that I can work with. One other thing, though, the head is too elevated. Because this is digital, this is basically like me being able to use an eraser. I'm going to drop it down so the chin is just a little bit closer to the shoulder line. And I need to be careful, though, because there is a good healthy distance between the clavicles and the chin in this. So I may be second guessing myself by saying I need to lower it that much. By removing muscles, things look awkward until we put those muscle masses back in. So I think I will lift it back up, but I'm also moving it over this way slightly. Now, the more mathematical way to determine foreshortening would be to know the length of the segment that you're going to move in space. Use this point right here as the center of an ellipse that you're going to draw. And let's say we want to swing the arm over this way in front of her. So I'm going to draw the maximum height of this length above and below. That's my starting point. Then I'll draw the ellipse and connect those 2 points together. And this is in reference for which direction I want the arm to rotate in. I'm going to rotate it this way. I'll leave this one as the length of measure for the upper arm that I'd like to use to cross over the body. The hardest part of this is finding the correct ellipse that shows us the perspective. And that can take a little bit of time to get used to. But let me draw this again over here. I'll draw the length. I'll draw the 2 heights, and then I'm going to go through a series of errors. Well, I can't draw an ellipse like this. It doesn't look like it's supporting what's going on. Plus, it doesn't even come close to touching the top and the bottom. I can draw an ellipse like this. But the problem with that is it feels like it's turned away too much from us. I'm judging each ellipse I build on the visual appearance of it. That actually looks a little bit more like what it should feel like if it's rotated in this direction. And that means then I'd repeat the same line in the back. And now we have a cylinder from front to back that doesn't quite line up with the center line, but it shows us the direction that it's rotated in. And this ellipse here has given us a front and a back. This is how long the length is going to be. We have everything measured in perspective now. The only thing left that has high variability to it is plotting the final ellipse to get it to feel right visually. And I would say that this ellipse also looks a little wrong in terms of how this is facing towards us. And if I were to open it up just a little bit more and then remove the excess on the inside of it, let me just clean that out and start it again here. That actually looks rotated almost like this one, which means we probably have it right. Now, we don't use vanishing points and vanishing lines to find the segments of the body. There's really no need for that. That's drawing too much attention to a mechanical approach that's better suited for things like this box. This box would be great to find the horizon line. Let's see, this is actually going back in space this way. So let me rotate it a little bit, find it here, bring this forward, drop this down through here, and notice how now the box looks even more connected to the ground plane because I'm using the same horizon line to fit the box onto. Both of these vanishing points are along the same axes, where this was second guessing myself. By going back and observing the reference, it helped me clarify the angle that we were looking for here, making it a little bit more accurate to the need. And then I'm using positive and negative space. How much does this knee stick out from the body? Where is this inside of this shape from edge to edge? These are my perspective tools. And then building correct ellipses within each segment of the body is the other strong supportive perspective tool that's going to get me something that feels that much more convincing in a foreshortened manner. And now we have a seated pose. As difficult as it was to find all of this in here, it really wasn't all that difficult. It was just making adjustments to things that were drawn incorrectly in the first place. And that can take some time. But like I've shown you here, I stuck with the problem until it was solved. I didn't just toss it and start a new one because likely I would repeat all the same mistakes again. And I see this quite often with students that they get something wrong, so they start it again. They get that one wrong and they start it again. And if you just stick with one, problem solve it all the way through, you do it once, but you also learned a lesson in what was wrong with it, made corrections, and that's going to remain in your memory because it's basically like winning a race. You just crossed the victory line, and all of those things that you did are positive influences bringing the drawing up into a better finish. You don't forget things like that, and that's going to help you problem solve in the future when you draw other poses that are similar. Now, when I'm using the ellipses on the body, I'll draw an arm here from the top to the middle. Remember that golden ratio. I'm going to take 2/3 of this, and this is going to be the height of this segment. And then we have the length for the hand. Muscles have a very similar pattern to them, both on the upper half and the lower half of the arm, the upper half and the lower half of the leg. I don't do this in the initial starting point for us learning because it becomes too mathematical. We already have to think about things like 8 heads high, 2.5 heads wide, 1 full head width through from front to back in profile view. There's already enough math involved. And for a lot of you, it's like, I didn't know I was going to be doing so much calculating. I didn't think that art had so much math to it. Well, it kind of does because we're measuring things for realism's sake. And the muscle structure on both the upper and the lower half of the arms, the upper and the lower half of the legs, are very similar in the way that the muscle is anchored to its origin and then connecting to its insertion. So the origin would be its starting point. The insertion would be where it terminates. In that structure, we're going to find that at the origin or at the upper half of all of the limbs where they're connected to the torso, the muscle mass is going to be at its largest. Then as it passes down the length, that muscle mass changes and it starts to taper downward. So I call this area the bulk area of the muscle. And then this is the tapering area. I'll just write the word taper. And then the lower third is the tendinous portion. So tendons. And if we do that again here, bulk, taper, tendon. Now there are exceptions to this rule. One of those being there's a muscle that crosses over from the upper to the lower half, which rotates our arm, and those are called supination muscles. On the leg, we have the kneecap, so there is a very clearly defined separation between the upper and lower half until we rotate it to the back of the leg. And on the back of the leg, we have the calf muscle. If this is where the knee is here, the calf muscle starts up here and crosses over into the lower segment of the leg. While these muscles are doing the same thing, they don't have the same extreme as this muscle does. On the leg, the calf muscle is the exception. On the arm, the ridge muscles are the exception. In addition, there's muscles right along here that go to your thumb. But what they do is create an additional curve, but that curve is tightly bound to the bones. It's not going to be as bulky as, say, a bicep. If you were to develop your thumb muscles, they aren't going to be extreme like the bicep is. So this is a pattern for building the body. We have this bulk, taper, and tendon. Now, when the limb is rotated in perspective, we have the front of it here, we have the back of it here, and then we build the length through. We still want to follow this. So I take the length of either one of the lines, and I'm going to divide that into thirds. That is how it's going to look in perspective. We have one of the ellipses here, and we have the other one here. And I'm just making sure that I connect the ellipse to each of those measuring points. And what we now have is the same as we have here, and I have a place to go bulk, taper, tendon, bulk, taper, tendon. And it's going to make it a lot easier for me to refine the muscles in a foreshortened space versus trying to find the ultimate photo of somebody with their muscles in the exact same position so I can just copy them over. I'm still not going to understand what I'm doing. And in this case, I actually do, because I'm using a formula to help keep me in check and balance. So I'll do one more. I'm going to rotate it up this way and foreshorten it. Take this length, divide it into thirds, cross the ellipses through each of those points, and now I have bulk, taper, tendon, bulk, taper, tendon. And once again, I can solve this problem fairly easy because I have something mechanical that I can rely upon. Ultimately, I may not use all those ellipses when I'm quick sketching or when I'm gesture drawing something out very quickly to build, but I have the formula memorized. So when I go to put the muscles back on, I kind of know how I'm going to need to use them in reference to the length of the arm, because I've done this now so many times in exercise that it's just a knee-jerk reaction. It helps me solve the problem of these foreshortened instances by knowing that there is a formula that can make everything feel proper. Discord and Patreon links below. Like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe. We've learned the armature so far. The armature is a very useful tool, and it has two pathways that we can take. One to internalize and one to externalize, meaning that with one of them, going internal is the study of human anatomy. External is using cut lines for muscle groups to build functioning sketchwork, functioning drawings, finishes, and so forth. We don't start with the internal to get to the external on a finished illustration or painting. We use the knowledge from it. But if we want to study the figure, then we internalize it. I'm going to quickly draw out an armature here, starting with a rickety head, then the neck, then the pillow shape. And I'll just start with this first. So I'm not spending a lot of time on just building the armature because the core is actually the most important part. We'll look at this first. Now, to put a skeleton on the inside of it, we could use an extremely complex version, the realistic version of the skeleton. But for artistic purposes, we don't need to go this complex. We should actually try and simplify it down into an artistic language, which is what we're trying to do here. If we're building on formulas, we need a language, and it needs to be a simplified language, or else we're going to scare off half of the people that want to actually draw because they think they need to know all these complicated things to get to the next level, which you can simplify. So for the skull, we leave it elliptical. We'll put in a center line, and then we'll divide the head into thirds. Hairline, eye line, bottom of the nose, side planes, and then a small plane underneath for the chin. And the excess up here is above the hairline. It's the crown of the skull. And there is more mass above the hairline. So this is helping us divide the skull into its proper segments. If we look at this from profile view, starting with that tilted oval, adjusting or adding a neck, making the adjustment of the chin, flattening the face plane, and then finding the side plane. And how I'm doing this, I'm thinking about that hairline, knowing that there is a little bit more above these three segments. These are our thirds. Ideally, each of these thirds should be the same length. This segment up here is 1/2 to 1/3 of one of these segments. And I say this because we're all different, and the top of the skull doesn't have a perfect measure to it. But it fits somewhere between these 2 points. And if you want to go even further and create Brainiac, then maybe make it the same length as one of these so that the forehead is taller and it gives him more space for a larger brain. This again is a specialized drawing or a character design that we're looking for, not actually how people look on a day-to-day basis or how people look. Remember, we're looking for an ideal for everybody. The circle we divide in half this way, and then we divide it again this way. And there will be another measure to that later. The bottom of the circle is also how we find those thirds. So this is roughly the side plane of the skull. We draw a line from that down to the chin, and that helps us separate the face plane from the side walls of the head. Part of our cheek and our jaw is part of the side. And that's how simple we keep it. The rib cage, we're going to draw as an oval. This oval, though, isn't going to be a perfect oval. It's going to be more like an egg, where the top of it is narrower and the bottom of it is wider. The narrowness, though, isn't like this. It actually does have a flare to it. We do want it to extend out. We have a few points of measure at the bottom of the rib cage that we want to memorize. The first is 10th rib, and that is the lowest rib on the rib cage. This arc crosses over the halfway line ever so slightly, but it does cross over. We don't want to just shear this away at the very bottom here. Each one of us is going to have a bigger or smaller, narrower or wider rib cage to each other, but ideally here we have this egg shape. Here we have the 8th rib. This is the widest point of the rib cage. So if one side isn't wide enough, then go back and make sure that both sides fit a little better to each other. Down below, and one more note of this, the pillow shape is designed to cater to the rib cage. The rib cage is the full segment of the upper half of this pillow, while the pelvis is 2/3 the height of the lower half. So we're not using the pillow shape to measure the height of the pelvis. We're using it to measure the height of the rib cage. The skull is 2/3 the height of the rib cage. So we can now use these two shapes to work off of each other to make better proportions of the head to the body. The opening of the rib cage needs to be designed. The base of the rib cage needs to be designed. This is facing towards us, and so is this. In profile view, the rib cage is tilted like this, facing upward. The back of our rib cage has a lot of curvature to it, while the front of the rib cage is planar. The sternum is planed out. The bottom of the rib cage as it opens up is also planed out. And we have two segments to it. This is a little more advanced, but I'm showing the difference between what the front and the back should look like on this. And the tilt is something like this. The pelvis, we can start with an ellipse. And in fact, when I put an ellipse on the lower half of the pillow and I put an ellipse on the upper half ellipse is trying to measure this length here between the bottom and top of the rib cage so that it's equally divisible. And as I can see here, I need to lower it a little bit to actually make that happen. While the pelvis, the ellipse that I put into the lower half of the pillow shape, is roughly at that 2/3 mark to indicate where the height of the pelvis is going to be. The shape of this is tapering towards the bottom and opening up towards the top. If we look at this shape from profile view, it angles as well. It's not straight up and down. In fact, neither one of these are. If you go into a classroom where there's a plastic skeleton, you're going to see them straight up and down because you're talking about pieces of plastic and they're all being screwed together and then gravity is pulling them down. They're not going to have all of these customized angles built into them, but that's how the human body works. Tailbone sticks out back here. The pubis sticks out over here. We don't need to draw either one of these though to get the shape in the right place, especially when we're talking about the pillow from profile. It's going to be fairly narrow because we're just looking for these contained shapes. Then eventually we will customize and make it more advanced, but that's in later stages. So with these angled downward, I'm going to draw another ellipse here, but I'm not going to shade it in because it's not the part that we're looking into. We're actually looking into this part up here. More so, I usually take the ellipse and I add angles to it specifically so that the back of the pelvis is narrower and the front of the pelvis is wider. The rib cage is just the opposite. The rib cage front is narrower and the rib cage back is wider. And from the profile or from the front view, you see the side walls as well as the front and the bottom and the top all at the same time. By narrowing these down, eventually when we put the muscles on, the little finger muscles on the side called the serratus muscles will be visible in the front view when they won't be on the back view. From the back view, you're only going to see the width of the largest muscle on the back, which is the latissimus dorsi muscle. That covers everything. Now the body has the rib cage wider in the back and narrower in the front, and the pelvis is just the opposite, so that when we lean over to the side, they can cross over each other without running into one another because they don't share the same widest points on the same side. They're on the opposite sides of each other. Going back to the pelvis to finish it, there's the opening that we sort of cheat a little bit. The wings, the iliac crests on the pelvis don't actually come back around and close down. They flare out. But in order for us to build the body correctly with the right size muscles, we compensate by building this like an enclosure and turn these lines inward towards one another. And this is eventually where the abdominal wall will separate from the external obliques, the muscles on the side of the body. And then we have another line down here, which is the elevation of the pubis bone. This is where the abdominal wall ends. And we need this line in here to anchor the bones down. Not to mention all of these extra lines give each shape another angle or another surface so we can see these things in perspective. And then we connect all of it together with the spine. In this case, it's nice and straight, running down to a tailbone that ends up being the majority of the width of this back surface along here. And then I'm going to also give it a thickness. So I'm kind of drawing it like an old arrowhead, the old flint arrowheads. And at the very top surface here, there's enough space to open up the spine and draw it on top of that, a connection point. And then from the profile view, the spine goes right behind the jaw, not at the back here, which I see a lot of people do in the beginning. Then it runs on the inside of the rib cage. We have curve number 1. And then the space between the rib cage and the pelvis. Curve number 2 from here to here. Curve number 3 from here to here. So there's 3 opposing curves. 1, 2, 3 in profile view. Front view, you're not going to see it as extreme. Now I'll draw one limb for the top and one limb for the bottom. Draw the leg down to the foot. Need to look at this height and duplicate it. So our foot is going to end somewhere right around here. The leg tapering lines from the pelvis. And I'll go ahead and throw a few ellipses in here just to remind me that I have depth to work with. The arm, elbow runs somewhere near the bottom of the rib cage. The wrist lands on what is called the great trochanter. I'm going to draw this oval in right now, then I'll explain it. And then the length of the hand. And I probably should draw this arm too because we need to see the hand shape. So I'll draw the arm out like this. I'm going to draw, here's my pivot point. Somewhere, let's see if I drew a big circle. Somewhere right around over here will be the end point of the length of the arm. Hand shape, and then the thumb. And an ellipse right here. Both the arm and the leg are attached to the body via ball joint. The ball joint that's up here is connected to the scapula. The scapula is on our back. And I'll draw the bone of this in just a moment, but this is the only part that we're going to see through here. And then another part that comes up this way. And this is right here is called the acromion process. The clavicle comes from the pit of the neck. So on the rib cage, we have the sternum through here. The spine is taken over in this drawing, so it's going to be harder to see. And I'm drawing it over here just to really make sure we understand the shape language. There's a small portion up here called the manubrium. Then we have the length through here. That's the sternum. And then we have a little triangle down here, and that's called the xiphoid process. And notice how it looks like a necktie. That's roughly the design, the shape and the design of the sternum. And then the rib cage attaches here and here. This little part hangs out in the middle of our rib cage in the big opening. Both clavicles attach over here, and they're not wheels. They're actually like blocks. But it doesn't make any sense that a block would rotate. So we draw it in the shape of a wheel to remind us that it has a rotation point on here so that the clavicle can rotate upward, downward, or level out. The clavicle comes out and is the shape of a bicycle handlebar, like a little tricycle with a little grip over here and tassels and so forth. So it's the shape of a bicycle handlebar. And there's a little end over here called the acromion bump, and that locks into, in a very small spot, the acromion process. This goes back and attaches to the scapula shape, which is going to be something like this. And I'll show you a little cheat or hack to drawing this easily each time. And then the head of the upper arm bone is locked into this little dish right here called the glenoid cavity. This angles up this way, attaches to this, and from above you have clavicle and scapula that form a corner or a block for the shoulder. So our shoulder is actually a block shape. Now the hack for the scapula. First, draw a triangle that's like this. In fact, you could start it with a box. Divide the box in half, create a triangle. And then everything else we add is going to be a triangle shape. We have a triangle up here. We have a triangle extension here. We have a triangle extension here. Then we have another triangle extension. If we want to just kind of look at it that way, the way that the acromion process comes up is at an angle, so it's like drawing another triangle. From profile view, the scapula has a curvature like this that's flush with the rib cage, and the outer surfaces are in straighter lines. So it's much more solidified, sturdy out here, while this sweeps across the back of the rib cage. Our scapula is not fixed. It moves. This is helping it move nicely and smoothly over the curved surface. So now we go into the arm bones. So the bone up here has very specific landmarks to it. At the base, it has what looks like a mallet or a hammer head to it. And then halfway up the length is a little bump that sticks out, which is eventually going to be where the deltoid attaches. So this gives a very specific measure for the muscles once we attach them. And it sits halfway in the length of the bone. For the lower half of the arm, which I'll do over here because it's going to be easier to see, I draw the length here. Bring that out to the hammer shape. Notice how that fits perfectly inside of the armature, just like the rib cage did, just like the pelvis did. They all fit inside of this. This is an extension. This is an extension. And eventually the kneecap will be an extension. That means those go on after the armature. But we don't build the armature to compensate for those bones. And now we get this drawn in at length. And then we have two bones in the wrist. We have the radius and we have the ulna bone. The ulna bone is the stick, the drumstick. It's on the pinky finger side, and it attaches to the very center of this little hammer shape. It goes from wider to narrower. The radius bone is attached to the outer side, so it would be over here on this one, and it's over here on this one. There's a little ball shape that's extended on the hammerhead, and then the actual bone itself has a curvature to it that's like this. And I just drew outside of my armature, which I didn't mean to do, but my lines are getting a little bit messy and I need to be heavier handed here. So the one bone, the ulna, goes from wider to narrower and ends in a circle. It looks very much like a drumstick that you play the drums with. And then next to that is the radius bone. It locks into the side of this. This also sticks out a little bit here. And then it has an S curve to it through here. There's a space on the inside here for the thumb muscles. That's where the thumb muscles are anchored. But this bone is designed so it can rotate over and then be on this side of the arm when we're supinating our wrist. So it can rotate over here, and this curvature helps keep it clear of obstruction on this bone. As well, it gives gap to the space where the thumb muscles are anchored, so nothing is rubbing against each other. Everything is smoothly rotating. Now, an easy, quick way to draw these in without getting lost in all the lumps and the bumps. When our palm is facing upward, we would draw the two bones like the number 11, parallel to each other. When the thumb is rotated downward and the palm is facing down or behind us, we'll draw the bones like the letter X. So like this is over here, the letter X, or this is over here, the two parallel lines. And that helps keep the bones in line with the action, which eventually will be markers for us to know where to put the tendons of the muscles in the forearm. So in profile view, the thumb is facing forward towards us. We still find the ulna bone first, because that's the anchor bone. Then we're going to rotate this like so and put the radius bone in over here. And then finally for the hand shape, we have the wrist bones that are this portion, and then all the finger bones that are this portion. And we can divide this into 4 sections, and then just very easily separate 4 finger lengths. And if you want to be really specific, then in each of those finger lengths, you're going to draw the first segment the longest, then take 2/3 of that for the second segment, and then the third segment should be 2/3 of this segment. The fingers and the toes are both designed this way. Now coming down to the lower leg, if we divide this length from the bottom of the pelvis to the top of the foot, kind of in half, but we also want to make an adjustment for that. I want to start in half, and then I'm going to drop this ellipse down a little bit so we get the same ratio here. One segment is 2/3 the previous segment. And this is the same for the arms and the legs as it is for the fingers and the toes. The kneecap is going to be below this divider line. Then for the femur bone, which is the large bone in the leg here, this angles inward and gets wider as it comes down to the base, a platform. Up here, there's a second ball shape and what's called the neck that attaches to this ball shape over here called the great trochanter. And then there's another little tiny ball just below that on the inside called the lesser trochanter. And this is going to be where a bunch of muscles from up in here anchor to. So that little bump is actually important. Then down below here, the kneecap I'm going to make an adjustment to and lift it up a little bit. So it covers most of this segment and it covers a portion of the next segment down below, which is called the tibia. So the tibia and the femur run into each other here, and the two of those bones basically form a box. Then the tibia comes down like this. It moves over this way with a little notch. And then the bone that sits next to it, our lower leg and the wrist, both have 2 bones in them for rotation, pronation and supination. We have another drumstick, only it has a drumstick on both ends, or the little hammer on both ends. The one that's down here is slightly offset to this ankle bone on the inside. So the lateral ankle is lower, the medial ankle is higher. And then the negative space that sits in between the two of those holds the foot in place. Go back to my skeleton. I'll draw this in. Let this stick out over here. I'll draw this in. Let this part stick out. And let this part stick out, making sure that they're offset from each other. Then I'll draw a line down through here to divide the 2 bones. There's no space in between these bones that's visible. They're basically leaning on each other. Although even that has a gap between it because we don't want any bones or muscles rubbing against one another, or you will definitely feel it as an electrical shock. And the negative space, and then finally the foot, which I'm going to draw in profile here in just a moment, toe box, arch, and the heel, which goes across in here. And that's all very messy. I'm going to draw it again over here. Inside the door wedge, we have the heel bone back here that sticks out of the door wedge. We have the toe block over here that sticks out of the wedge. We have an arch that runs across through here that stays within the wedge. And then we have the bone that the ankles connect to sitting at the peak point of this arch. Remember that the arch is like a shock absorber to our body, and it collapses or flattens with pressure as we apply pressure to the foot flat-footed. And as well, it helps alleviate pressure when we're running and we're rolling off of our toes and so forth. Most people are inclined to put the bones back here, which is not the place to put it. You're completely avoiding the arch altogether by having the hammer over here, basically. Or, yeah, I'll call this a hammer because it's pushing downward, beating downward as we're walking. We don't want that mounted to the heel. We want it connected to the arch where that pressure is going to be applied. And then the kneecap sits right here in reference to both the femur bone and the tibia. Now I'm going to draw these bones here one more time in profile view. Femur bone, the front of it, the block, and then the back of it. And here's where our flexion comes into play. Tibia bone, flexion, ankle, shin bone. So again, flexion, flexion. And that's the same thing with the arm. We have curvature, and then the forearm is a little bit messy because we have one curve going this way and the other curve going this way for the sake of rotation, but we still have flexion involved in the way that the bones are designed. When they close down, there's more space in between for the muscle masses. From the profile view, we also have the kneecap out here. From the profile view of the rib cage, we have the scapula sticking out here. These are extension bones. Our armature is not designed for the extension bones. It's designed for the majority of the bones. And then we add the extensions. In the same way that the little lumps and bumps of the bones also stick out from the armature. The armature is encapsulating the size and the width of the bones in general, but there are a few exceptions, like the ankles, like this bump right here. In the wrist, this bump right here. And of course, the entire clavicular shape kind of extends up and out of the pillow shape a little bit, especially the acromion process. These are things that cannot fit within the pillow shape or the cylinder forms, but try to make a concerted effort to actually extend them. And then you'll have a good balance between what fits perfectly inside and what actually does stick out that we see on the body through the skin, called subcutaneous points. Now the leg, we start off with this block, but the reality of this half is that it's kind of like this. It's like a little wedge that has a wheel on the back of it. And that's because of the rotation of these bones. And then also this has a curvature on the top of it, kind of like a wheel well. And the wheel fits nicely in the wheel well. From profile view, the bumps are offset from each other. The ball shapes are offset from each other like this. In a seated position, the great trochanter is facing this way. The length of the bone and the end of the bone. Wheel shape, wedge shape. And this is now sitting on top of the platform of the tibia like this. And the ankle. And the kneecap is going to be sitting here in between both of these bones, and it's attached to the muscles up here. It's also attached to a tendon that anchors to this part of the tibia bone. This is called the tibial tuberosity, and that's what the kneecap, the patella, is attached to. When we're kneeling, this is going to rotate back even farther. So one more drawing here of the femur, flexion line, extension line, end block first, then the wheel shape and the wedge, and then the tibia is back here. Let me draw this more horizontally. Start it with its box shape to the ankle, and the kneecap sits here, directly out in front of this bone. So the tendon stretches here and as well up here. Then I'll put this curve in. And I was fighting with that curve at first because I was getting lost in the details instead of starting with the basic shape the way I should have. If I start with the box, it's so much easier to draw. And then fine-tune for that more organic connection. Place the kneecap out front, and there is a little bit of space between the kneecap and the rest of the leg. That's why I give it the space that we need here. There's a bursa sac that sits back in here. So in a kneeling position, in a seated position, and in the standing position. If we draw this from the front view in a seated position, great trochanter, the neck, the ball joint, the length of the bone, which I just forgot I need to angle over a little bit. I'm going to draw it over this way. Then I'm going to draw the box shape through. So if we look at this from the front or the side, it has the same kind of width to it. And that makes it a cube when we're standing upright with both of the bones connected together. Side plane, bottom plane, the other side plane, top plane, and the tibia. I'm going to do the same thing and do a draw through with it. And then drop the length of the tibia down to the floor. The kneecap is going to sit right here. This is a platform facing upward. This is probably too wide. I can narrow it down a little more. And then to draw the femur, if we're going to be technical about it, we could start with the box and then cut a hole out here. And this is where the two wheels are, here and here. And the rest of this angles up and gets narrower towards the front. And then finally the fibula. And technically that's how you would build a seated leg, with this foreshortened and this at length. And then technically, if we needed to get all the lumps and bumps in the right spot, we could divide it into thirds, so we would know the scale that we would need to make each of those segments. And this is, technically speaking, the skeleton within the armature. The reason why we designed the armature is that it is a really basic version of the skeleton. Imagine doing this for every illustration you're ever going to make. That'd be a little bit crazy. But the armature is a great substitute for that. And with it divided into thirds in the proper segments, with the pillow shape being divided where it needs to, we have these really nice markers all over it. And those are the markers that we aim for when we place the muscles on top, which is what we'll look at in the next video. Here's the first of two demonstrations that I've done. They are sped up at about 250% of their normal speed. And if you'd like to watch the actual speed of these demonstrations, you can go over to my Patreon page and sign up for it. And there's a completely different commentary kind of working out the technicalities of these. But I wanted to share these to show, again, the legitimacy of the armature being a skeletal container and the simplicity of it, including all of the mistakes that I make along the way, because everybody makes mistakes when they're making art. And so many demonstrations on the internet sort of avoid the mistakes. They sort of take them out. And I want to make sure that everything stays in here, because we all make mistakes. And they're just, when we see something that looks wrong, and if we can catch it in time, we make improvements. Which also brings me to another problem that a lot of people suffer from, which is making mistakes at all. They just don't want to make them. And so many people avoid making art because they're afraid of making those mistakes. But it's how you succeed. If you don't make the mistakes, how are you going to get any better? You can't rationalize betterment from good things done already. I mean, you can improve upon that if you have an idea of where you'd like to go with it beyond what you've done. But it's the mistakes that show you repetitious problems, repeated problems that we create as a habit that maybe we don't recognize at all until it's too late in each piece that we do, and maybe don't even recognize that we're doing them on a consistent basis. The mistakes help you recognize these things. And then it's up to you to make up your mind how to fix them, how to remedy them. When even things like this floor plane, I'm trying to get the line to aim for the right spot, and it might take 2, 3, 4, 5 times, especially when the pictures are larger and larger. Drawing something on a larger scale is very difficult to do. The bigger something gets, the more accuracy or the more distance there is for accurate notes, accurate marks, especially something linear like these measuring lines, or something ovoid like the ellipses. The bigger something gets, the harder it is to do. In practice, you want to create variety so that you don't run into this issue. Draw little pictures, draw big pictures, draw them at every scale. Don't stick to one size only. Unless, of course, you have something like a class where you need to stick to a format because it needs to be turned in that way. Then it's totally understandable that you have to stick to the rules. But in your own practice, make sure to break all that up and give yourself a variety to work from. Dexterity isn't built on one scale. It's built on a variety of scale and a variety of marks, different ones. In the case of lines that we draw, for any kind of picture, there's only 4: the straight line, the C curve, the S curve, and the enclosure curve, which is like an O, a circle. We have to practice those really large, really small, very small, in order for us to know that we have the ability to make art on any scale. If you've ever drawn in a little tiny notebook and then tried to go over to a big canvas, then you know what I'm going to talk about here, which is the intimidation factor. You're used to doing things on a small scale, but all of a sudden now you have to approach it on a much larger surface. Some of those habits that we form, like drawing with implements on a really small scale, are unfathomable on that larger canvas. We have to upscale our tools. So if we work with a pencil in a little notebook, then we might need to work with a stick of charcoal or a stick of graphite on the larger scale in order to compensate for the scale. But you're not going to know that unless you actually do that. In this particular image, the floor plane has been drawn in, and that's what's making it a little bit easier for me to find the forms and give them the perspective that they need. I'm going to be drawing some ellipses around some of the major bones here, and those ellipses are based upon how the eye can see things from the horizon line. The floor plane helps us ground the figure so it feels tangibly in place. The horizon line, though, is our eye line, and that defines what we see above it and what we see below it, making it feel larger or smaller based upon the type of object that it is. The horizon line gives us a place to look above and below, and the ellipses help our brain feel the three-dimensionality. For some, those ellipses are literally ellipses at first, just circles or ovals. But then eventually, as you progress in your work, you start to notice them become more and more dimensional. So there's a boundary that you have to breach in order to be able to feel that and see it for yourself and understand it to be that way. And that takes practice and repetition in order for you to be able to get the brain to see it that way. Just because you've drawn it once doesn't mean that you fully understand it. It just means, okay, now you know what to do. Now do it over and over and over again until you recognize the tools and what the tools mean. And then everything changes. And all of a sudden, again, that fun comes back into it because 3 dimensions are actually starting to happen on the page, which is really exciting when you can see your pictures come to life in that way. Coming to life isn't just seeing an expression or seeing the pose really active. It's knowing that there's a front and a back, and you can see around that form to feel it. Art touches us on 2 levels. There's the seeing part of it, and there's the feeling part of it. Externally, our eyes see it, and we can appreciate it. It's a problem that's solved. It's an illusion that's well crafted by hand. And it took skill to get there and make it. And we definitely appreciate these things in other human beings. But that's just on a visual level. Internally, we feel something more than just the marks on a page and colors applied. We might empathize with it. We might agree with the story or the message that's being told. We might cry. We might laugh. Or even feel good from what we see. This goes far beyond the craftsmanship of the piece. These two aspects, the internal and the external, are what make great pieces. Good pieces are either technically sound or maybe not very well done, but the message has been imparted very well so we can relate to it. But when you can get both of those to connect together, that makes something really, really great. It almost makes it to the point where we need to own this. We need to have this piece. And that's a pretty incredible thing when it can touch us on so many different levels. But it does take skill to do that, and it takes practice. So many of us want to do figurative work, but we get caught up in being a copy machine. We copy the photo instead of recreate the photo. That is why we do all these extra steps that seem like, why would you do all of that when you can just outline it and shade it in? Well, of course you can. But are you copying the photo, or have you practiced it enough to the point where you are recreating the photo? And recreating it is literally like taking another photograph, but only in this case, when we make art, it has a chance of surpassing the photo's dimensionality, meaning that if you can build 3 dimensions using these tools, you have a greater chance of creating the perfect range of values and the perfect range of colors, something a photograph can't do at the same time. It can't do both of those at the same time, especially digital photography. It's very limited. And we can see the moment, and yay, that's pretty cool. And for some of us, we took the photo because it's a special moment and we don't want to forget it. But to make a great piece of art, it's not just supposed to look like a moment. It needs something more, as I've already mentioned. Now, as you watch me do these drawings again, I did a front and I did a back so that you can sort of see the full range. In the coming videos, I'll do a few more demonstrations that show various types of poses, action poses, reclined poses, seated poses, to give you a good range of problem solving on so many different levels. The tools never change though. They're always the same tools because I'm building upon consistency, which is what we all have to do. And I'm okay with making mistakes. That's part of the process. The more of those mistakes I make and I'm conscious of, the more opportunities I have to realize a better solution. And that again is why I'm really adamant about don't worry about the mistakes, make them. They're absolutely important if you're going to get ahead with your work. If you just do the things that you feel comfortable with, you're going to reinforce those things, but then there's everything else that you still need to learn that you're not even trying to do. That really doesn't make any sense. If you want to become an artist, you have to build your toolbox, and you have to be willing to throw out some things, be okay with making those mistakes, then take the mistakes and not harshly criticize them, but turn them into wins by solving them, fix them, and then move on to the next one. All of your mistakes that you make and solutions for those mistakes are a part of your working memory, a part of your working history that helps give you answers for the future drawings you haven't yet done. So it is absolutely important that those mistakes be made. Don't feel bad about it either. It's not time wasted. It's practice. No musician is going to be like, oh, I can't play that song because I'm no good at it. They're going to master that song, and then when they go on tour, they're going to play it 100 different ways. And when they come back, they won't even think about it anymore. It's just another song that they can pick up their instrument and start playing because they've built on all of the experiences, and those future performances are going to be stellar. They're intuitive. And it gives the musician a chance to really disappear into that music. In the same way as an artist, you can disappear into your pictures knowing that you have all of these tools in your tool bag that you have worked really hard and repetitiously to perfect. Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and share this video. And I'll see you all in the next one. Hello. Well, as I promised, I'm doing this round of critiquing to give you an idea of what critiquing is. Now, keep in mind that critiquing is not meant to be harsh or negative. Critiquing is how we actually learn. In order to move forward as an artist or in any industry, any career, you need some kind of feedback in what you're doing to know whether or not you're doing it correctly. So this is going to give an example of what I do in my classes, what I do in my mentorships with the students, and try to help them understand how to take their work to the next level. I have several here, which is awesome. I'm really thankful for all of you who decided to participate in this. And when I do more of these in the future, I hope that I receive a number of them again so that we have a good, robust round of critiquing to do. So let's get started. On this first page here, there's two things that we're capturing. We're capturing the essence of the container for the skeleton. That's the first thing. So there's no muscles involved. It's just the container for the skeleton. That container consists of the pillow shape, the head shape, hands and feet, and then the arms and legs are cylinders, and they should remain cylinders that also need to be curved in the direction that the bones curve in for their flexing side, and that's called flexion. The floor plane needs to be consistent with the photograph. It's not something arbitrary, and it's not alone. It needs also the horizon line and the connection between the two. In this particular set of images, we have dots on the floor. That doesn't work because it's not really giving us an idea of the space that the person is encompassing. While it is a platform of sorts, we need something more measurable, and that's where that floor plane comes in. So with the floor plane, it's a grid of sorts, and that grid goes back in space to the center vanishing point where the camera lens is. The camera lens is your eyes. The floor plane is the relationship between the camera, the model, and you. Between those 3 points, you're going to be able to see elevation more clearly. These dots and no horizon lines, we're not really getting a good sense of proximity and elevation, but we are seeing the contact point of the floor. Now over here, the feet are angled this way while the floor plane is going this way. They don't actually line up together. And that's pretty easy to see in the toes, which is easy to fix as long, again, as we have the floor plane. And we know that the floor goes back this way, and the foot will fit on this surface. This is the contact point. And as long as the contact point doesn't have some arbitrary angle to it that makes it not really feel like it's on the floor, but it's angled up off of the floor, it's going to be very obvious to see. These do look like they're making contact with the floor plane. They coincide with the surface, and they feel like they're laying down on the surface. This is muscle. This is bending in the wrong direction. Both of these should be containers only, which means they're not going to be nearly as big as the person in the photo. This is too much as well. This is muscle mass. This doesn't have a pillow bend in it. The pillow bend shows us which direction the pillow is folding in, or flexing forward, or flexing to the side. It gives us a flexion point in the torso. Without one, like this as well, we don't see the difference between the two halves, and we're bound to make it out of proportion. This is too short from top to bottom. If we had a better connection in the center, we might see the different elevations. The elevation here is narrower than the elevation here, is different than the elevation here, or the height of each of those is a little bit different. When we first start, we want to roughly make each one of them the same height to one another. This one is also much too wide, and the arms and legs are very big, very heavy, which basically means that we're capturing the muscle mass instead of looking at the joints and narrowing things down a little bit. The head on this one is kind of coming off of the body. It doesn't feel connected to the neck, and it doesn't feel balanced with the chin forward and the back of the skull having less distance from the neck cylinder. This one is the same size as the neck, which would be out of proportion. The same thing is happening over here. We have the neck fused with the chin when the chin should actually be more in front of the neck, and there's going to be less space back here between the two sides. The arm is disconnected here. The leg is disconnected over here. We're not building just anything. We're connecting all of these points together to create a continuum through all the body parts. Now on this one, the feet are too small, and the foot also feels a little bit disconnected here. We're again kind of going after the width of the body and not looking within the smaller spaces. And this is one of the first things that is really difficult for a first timer using these tools to get used to. We see what we see, and until we actually know the difference between the muscles and the skeleton, we are probably going to contain all of it together. Eventually, we don't do that anymore, but it's the way we start. The feet, or at least this foot, feels a little bit arbitrary. We're actually looking at the underside of the foot, and then the toe plane is out here mostly in profile. So the foot is going to have a perspective of something like this. This foot is too small, and it's also disconnected from the leg. The lines of the leg can be drawn straight through the foot, and definitely do that, so you don't end it too soon. And also be careful not to build platforms in the feet. I think this one sort of has a platform. What that means is it looks more like a shoe instead of looking like that door wedge. This is the pivot point for the ankle, and it should sit somewhere in the middle of the cylinder, acting as the pivot point. The feet on this one are too small. The feet on this one are too small. That's also a normal thing. The proportions of the extremities usually end up too small or too big for a while. We have heads that are too big, heads that are too small, hands and feet that are doing the same thing. Floor planes look fantastic on these, and so do the ellipses, the draw through on all of the forms. This limb is a little bit on the stiff side. It could have a little more curvature to it, and so can this one. But overall, and then there's no bend in the pillow. We're not looking at the muscles, we're looking at the container space for the skeleton. When I first put the word out to bring drawings in so that I can do reviews, I didn't give an ultimatum to what to do, but a lot of people did do the first chapter of the series, the Armatures, and then others kind of gave me what they draw, and I think that's fine. I'm going to relate this to the Armature though, just to give an idea of what happens when we do other sketch types. In all of these images here, you've done a really good job of capturing the poses. There's no doubt about that. But the problem with, like, say, this one down here, is that we're combining shadow patterns with muscles, with contours that sort of bump and lump in different places than the actual muscles sit. As a result of that, we have too much confusion. We want to build things up in steps. That's why there is a step process when you first learn. Armature, skeleton, muscles. Then we put the flesh back on, we put a local value in, shadow values, and then the gradations. There's a specific walkthrough step-by-step process when you're first learning that really helps identify what each step is. This is a result of combining them all together because we're not really sure what to do, so we just sort of sketch what we see. In places like this, the muscle is missing, and back here it's overextended. And then we have a complete disconnection here and here with these other shapes that should be the shoulder, and under the clavicle there's going to be a little shadow. So we have a shadow, a separate muscle, a lack of muscle, flow, but none of those go together. And then the hair shape is sort of arbitrary, and that's why we take the hair away and we just draw the oval for the head with a chin, side plane, and then division lines, so that we can fit the hair on like a wig, right? We're putting the hair back on the skull after we found the skull. There's a kind of an orderliness to it. The feet, the same thing. We start with simple feet so that we don't end up creating feet that are too large or too small, and arbitrary toes. Same with the hands. Arbitrary fingers, arbitrary shapes, lengths that are a little bit different than what they should be. And there's a lot of mystery as to where to fix these things. And then there's the absence of the floor plane and the horizon line. So a lot of the mark making that we're doing ends up becoming flat to the eye as opposed to dimensional to the form that we're looking for. But like I said before, there's some nice sketching happening here, and any kind of sketching you do is good sketching because it's moving you forward. We need practice, and we need practice all the time. If we can get more informed practice, we're going to learn quicker. When we're just practicing and we're just drawing, it gives you mileage, which keeps your dexterity up. See, doing drawings just of anything and not really thinking about what we're drawing is a mileage thing, and it keeps your wrist loose and it keeps your dexterity built. However, if we're trying to learn, we need informed direction that we're going in order for us to be able to advance ourselves, because we're not going to advance ourselves when we're drawing something that we're second guessing the entire time. Thank you very much. These are great, and I appreciate everything that's been turned in. The same thing is sort of happening here, and this methodology, it's like we're showing how we do perspective, but this is far too much. It's way too much information. We don't need the special vanishing point. We don't want the vanishing point to be arbitrary. The vanishing point is always centered down in the photograph that we're working from. Every photograph has a vertical line to it. That vertical line is dead center to the photograph. This is the line that the camera lens is going to fall across. The camera lens is not going to point in an arbitrary corner. If it does, then the photograph is going to be taken from there, and then we have another vertical line. In this case, I tipped it, which I shouldn't have done, but we would, if the vanishing point was over here, the entire photograph would be over there. The camera is always going to be centered to the photo, but not necessarily dead center. There will be a height to it depending upon its pitch on the tripod or in someone's hand that they're holding the camera in. With the armatures, they're very loosely sketched. However, there's muscles, and then there's no muscles, then there's no perspective, and then things like this shoulder is missing, and so the arm is in an arbitrary location. It doesn't feel connected. We don't have center lines, which is going to show a measuring point for us to see the left side and right side, which is also important because when we know where this is in reference to the left side and right side, then we also know how much there is for a side plane, because we are going to see more than one surface, and that gives us an advantage of how to find the information. Then lastly, the ellipses are drawn in, which is great because drawing all the way through is really important. But we want to also remember that those ellipses are perpendicular to the length of each of these. So these are both pitched in different directions when they should be like this to the length. We want a center line in here so that we can get these to become perpendicular to its center point. And then over here we have two separate sections where we want one solid flow through. Now there used to be an old methodology that animators used, and that had ball joints to it. The reason for this method is to track each joint for the sine wave of motion. When we're going to be drawing multiple frames to get a character to move, we need trackable points on the body. However, the ball joint is also a little difficult to use because it removes the actual joint of the body, which we have to find later. And as a result of this, we also start doing different things with the segments, where if we just kind of keep everything uniform all the way through, we're finding the correct angle of both the knee and the elbow, and we're creating a solid continuous shape all the way through. We don't have as much to repair later on. In fact, we don't have anything to repair later on, as these lines become the skeleton and the tendons between the muscles. So we're basically setting ourselves up with part one of two parts, and that is part of the end result of the drawing once we're done. So a little bit of the armature is in the finish. It's the stuff in between the muscles, the stuff that we get a little bit more fixated on. Now, as I've been describing everything here, we need floor planes. The floor planes are going to help us with the perspective. The curves on the back of this particular drawing are curved in the wrong direction. Her rib cage is actually turned upward this way, so these curves are going to go with that. And then the curves down here, we can see on the underwear line that the curve does go downward. So this one is working. A little bit too narrow, very large shoulders, no connection of the neck either at the back of the skull or in the body. And then we have muscles. If we don't know which muscles they are, but we know the curves, we're going to make the muscles too large. We're going to put the curves in the wrong spot as far as the apex goes. And this again is where we want to simplify things down and start with something that is a foundation shape as opposed to the details, because the details are what come back and sort of throw things off in terms of volume and as far as perspective goes. Without the floor plane and the horizon line, we're second guessing the location of the figure in elevation space or in 3D space, the verticality of it, and the relationship of the model to our eyes. Our camera is low in this particular photo, but this feels like the camera is up somewhere near the head because of the angle of all the curves, or the angle of all the ellipses rather. And then these ellipses are also not perpendicular to the length line, where these are better and these are better. And even these are better over here. Some of them are a little bit off, like these are also off. The leg is going back in space this way. The curves should run like this to them. If we put those perpendicular lines in, then we can draw the ellipse over that perpendicular line. And then finally, there's a lot of shapes here that are trying to have a lot of detail in them when we really just need to simplify them back, do a simple draw through, so we can see all sides at the same time. This is the contact point usually on the floor, but it's also the depth and dimension of the foot. Sometimes we don't see the foot in 3D space, and we make feet and hands flat and one-dimensional rather than them being three-dimensional with the figure, and as a result, we have two completely different pictures being drawn in the same picture space, throwing both of them off a little bit because one is more graphic while the other one is more dimensional. These are similar drawings to a previous, I think this one here. Yeah, we're using the same. This one's lacking a leg, so it's probably drawn at the top of a page. Whenever you're drawing a figure, make sure you have enough room for the whole figure. You do not want to crop the figure because you're not going to get the right volume. As a result of this one, this leg is too short in length. The torso is too short because we couldn't see the entire pose all at once. And that is going to throw off the perspective. This head and neck feels a little bit broken. It also feels too right angled to the body. It kind of doesn't fit on the body anymore. And the body is probably going to have a little bit more curvature in there to compensate for the angle of the neck. We don't have a draw through on the neck right here. We need to be able to see the entire neck. We need to be able to see the entire neck in connection with the body. We also want, again, that draw through so that we literally see the connection even when something is covering it up. And that's the same with the legs. Like this artist did right along in here with the leg. We can see the leg and the torso through this leg. That allows us to see the entire pose all at once. If we don't have the entire pose showing, parts are going to falter in dimensional relationship to the rest of the body or proportional relationship to the rest of the body. In this drawing right here, we don't have the entire leg drawn through, and we don't have the right curve out here. Because we're not seeing the entire length, we're starting to make things up a little bit. This leg is also curving in the wrong direction, and so is this one. So the lower legs, we're putting muscles on them, where the arms don't have the muscles, but they have the correct flexion lines. These particular legs are complete with muscles, and we want to leave that out for this particular stage. The foot here, these feet, this foot, and both of these don't have draw through to them. This one sort of does, but it is lacking the far line. We, again, want to be able to see all the way through for the foot, especially to make contact with the floor plane that's missing, bringing us to the horizon line, which will show us what's above the horizon line and what's below the horizon line. And then we have, so this is on a curved page. It makes it a little difficult to critique this one because the foot is getting really small, but it looks like the foot was sort of pushed onto the page to make it fit. It feels like it might be out of proportion to the rest of the body. We don't really have draw through on this one. And the far arm, as a result, doesn't really feel connected to the body. It almost feels like something else besides the body. And then there's, in this one here, the feet are too small, and the floor plane is a little bit on the warped side. It doesn't really feel like a solid surface. We want to try to make these as solid as possible on the ground. Or let's kind of think of them as like a yoga mat or a throw rug that you have on the floor plane, and make it as absolutely sound as possible in terms of all four of these lines. Keep them mechanically solid. In this particular photo, the camera is somewhere right around in this space. This is where our horizon line would be, and we would connect the floor plane to it, to this particular spot right here. This one, I think, is in a good position. This is roughly where the horizon line is, and that's the same with this one. Both of those have a similar horizon line in them. So we've done a really good job finding the horizon line. Now we just need to make sure that the floor is solidly connected to that horizon line, and then put a measuring grid within the floor so that we can also see a measurable space. The more we make contact with the floor plane, the more that we design the floor plane in a grid space, we're making it into a ruler, and that's a measurable tool. If it's just a big open square, we have a tendency to completely miss it, not even see it at all, and we get too focused on the figure, but we forget that we're trying to put the figure in 3D space. So that all of these little things add up to, if we don't have the answers there, we're second guessing everything. But if we have all the tools there, then it's just a matter of practicing until they start to work for us. And the more often we use them, the more they become habitual to our process. I want to thank everybody involved here. This was fantastic, this first round. I really wasn't thinking I was going to get very many drawings at all, but we have a good group of drawings here, and they're all fantastic. Just remember that. Every drawing that you do is part of learning. It's the mileage part. The more informed you practice, the more you're leaning into a process. The more you do this, the more repetition you create, the more the process will start to make sense. It'll be easier for you to use all of the tools in the future, and it'll make everything flow a little bit faster. And I want to say something about the word fast. We're not trying to draw fast, we're trying to draw accurately. That's more important. Take your time on these drawings. Don't think you're supposed to make them quickly. The more you spend on each one of them, the more you think about each one of them as you're building them, possibly and likely the more accurate they'll become. But if we're moving really quickly, we're going to make all sorts of errors that we didn't intend to, or that we overlook because we're too consumed with the process of making the drawing and quickly doing it instead of regulating each step that we're building with. Again, I want to thank everybody who was involved with this. I really appreciate your efforts, and thank you for letting me use these to critique. And for the rest of you, I hope this was a good lesson in quality critiquing. We're looking for the reasons why things aren't working more than doing anything else with them, because we are trying to find the mistakes so we can make a list of those mistakes. And each drawing we start with, we draw all the way through and we look for those mistakes first, fix those, and the more we do that, the more we become acquainted with the step, the easier it will be to add more steps. We're solidifying each step in the process, one step at a time. When we memorize one of the steps, it gives us more brain space to start working with the next one and successfully work with the previous because we already know it so well. All we're doing at that point is adding more information to the figure, making it feel more complete, which is getting us that much closer to being able to do these with success and just feeling good about being able to sit down and draw the figure without too many complications. There's always going to be a battle with proportions. There's always going to be a battle with line weight and line clarity. These are two things that the beginner is going to run into in their process of building. These are some of the things that we want to eliminate early on in our drawing process. These are beginner mistakes, and the more we can eradicate those, the more room we have to learn new things. And everything is about that, trying to get the process into the intuitive side of our brain so that we have more room for new tools and to be able to develop those and add them to what we already know. Thank you very much again for all of you who participated. I hope you learned something from this, and I look forward to the next round. All right, this is the bonus content. I'm out on location, and here is the location. Nice little pond, kind of near the house. It's over in a park. It's kind of getting late in the evening, so the sun is going down fairly quick and the shadows are going to grow long. What you're seeing right now doesn't have as many shadows, but as time goes on, the shadows are going to draw longer. And the thing that we all need to keep in mind when we go out on location is get the objects. Don't worry about the shadows. Shadows can come later. If you plan and map the shadows you see in the beginning, they're going to change by the end. That also means that you should plan your day and know what time of the day you're going to go do a certain location, go draw or paint that location, so you give yourself the chance to end it at the time of day that you were hoping to get there. Don't get there at the time of day that you want to draw it because it's going to quickly change on you. I'm using ballpoint pen and my clipboard with printer paper. This is my clipboard sketchbook. This is actually what I sketch with most of the time. Sketchbooks to me are interesting and convenient at times, but when I want to just go kind of all over the place and explore stuff, I find that the clipboard and printer paper is a far better way to go about doing it. Just to me, it's the more convenient approach. So just like a photo that we're working from, we are looking for the horizon line because that indicates where your eyeballs are. By knowing where the eye level is, you can produce a much stronger looking picture below and above the horizon line. Remember that everything is in perspective and everything relates to that horizon line out in front of you. So we draw the horizon line, find where I am, that little dot represents where I am, and then instead of drawing edge by edge by edge all the little tiny details, we're looking for the graphic shape that encompasses the whole object at once. You can see I'm doing very simplified shapes that encompass all the noise, and then I'll build the noise into it. I'm finding the ground plane out in the water, and I'm locating all of the volumes that are extending outward. So it's not going to have a curvature to it that curves upward. It's going to have a bunch of forms that are curving outwards towards us. That's all of the big plant forms in the back of the pond. And I found this nice little duck wading right in the middle of the water, and it's kind of nice. It's a target and it's a scale to the pond, and so that works out really well. Then once all of the big graphic shapes are in place, I start plotting the noise within. I'm not thinking about every single leaf and trying to match them perfectly. I'm sort of summarizing what I see and putting my own set of shapes in that resemble the object. Now, if I had a lot more time, if I knew I was going to come out here and repeat the drawing over and over and over again to finish it, then I might be a bit more critical about being more exacting to the shape language, to the number of reeds, the number of leaves, the number of ducks maybe, because that's what I'd focus on if this was day one of several days working on the same image. I also have this paper towel with me to wipe the pen, because as you can kind of see out there in the picture, there's all these little dots. Those little dots are ink building up on the ballpoint pen. As you move the pen across paper, it starts picking up all the fibers of the paper, and those gather at the tip of the pen, and that causes that ink blob to occur. So it's really important to keep that thing clean. I'd say wipe the pen every few minutes if you can. I know in this demonstration, I believe I miss wiping the pen a few times, and it's a little too late. I get a big blob out there, and then it's like, oh yeah, I forgot. And then I wipe it. Why the ballpoint pen, of all things? You have to be exacting to use a ballpoint pen because you have no erasability to it. It's there forever. You can't remove it from the surface. It actually trains you to be more confident. I would say use ballpoint pen as often as you can, because it's going to be a worthwhile endeavor to build confidence and make strong drawing choices with that ballpoint pen. Now I'm doing the larger reeds in the foreground, filling up these spaces because it is the foreground. It takes away from some of the background, and I do want that to happen so that I'm not drawing in the background too much and then finding, oh shoot, I need to put the foreground in. And it gets really noisy because it's competing with the shapes from the background. In many cases, if you go landscape painting with any paint medium, you're usually trying to go from the back to the front. But because this is ballpoint pen and its permanency and its linear properties, I can't get really tonal with this, it forces you to work just the opposite. I want to make sure that I have all the consumption done in the very beginning from the foreground shapes, and then I'll start moving my way back into the rest of the picture. So as you can kind of see with the hand jittering really hard, that this is done at 250%, so twice and a little more speed of what I would actually be drawing. It was a 38-minute drawing altogether, and it's been compressed down to something like 15 minutes. Now I'm working on what I would call the subject matter, all the ducks that are in the foreground. They make really interesting shapes. I'm not searching for anatomy, I'm not searching for likeness, I'm searching for shape language. And then with that shape language, I'm looking for the darker shapes, the lighter shapes, the middle value shapes. Then I'm using the ripple lines to help block out some of the shadow patterns underneath and break those up a bit. Incorporating water in with the reflections and the shadows at the same time so that I'm sort of taking on all of those properties at once. In the foreground, I want it to be a little bit darker. I want to make sure that there's a strength to the foreground that doesn't compete with the background. We think the ballpoint pen is going to be one uniform value because it really doesn't have value variation to it, but it does. The more you go over a line, the darker it gets, because not only does it get darker, but it also gets heavier, so that makes it feel more intense. I'll be coming back to these reeds several times throughout the drawing to pop them a little bit harder, especially as I start to put in some of the background values. I'm spending an extra amount of time in the foreground right now because I want to make sure that it's well established and that it also establishes a scale for the rest of the picture. Nicely, all the ducks are sort of facing in the same direction, so it doesn't create this crazy variety that I have to work out in my head. Once I have one of the shapes, it's sort of like I'm just going in repeat mode as I'm drawing all the other ones. But I still want them to all have their own personality and not just look like a rubber stamp that's stamped each one of them out. You'll see me hold the pen between my index finger and middle finger sometimes. That's to change the grip, to change the pressure. And because I have to keep the pad in the camera frame, I'm not rotating the pad enough, but I would actually rotate the pad in different directions to fill in these spaces if it weren't for the fact that I'm filming this right now. And I don't actually have like a tabletop that I can slide this on so that you're not looking at the ground and my legs and all the other things that become really distracting when the pad moves. I'm moving into the background and I'm filling in the darker part of the lake. And this takes a little bit of time. And this is definitely where you have to wipe the pen a lot because it doesn't stay clean for very long. See, I put a little dot in and then I needed to clean the brush, or I needed to clean the pen after doing that because it had built up too much of the ink on the end of it. And I'll do that several more times before I'm finished. But this is now establishing a firm middle ground. It's giving the ground plane substance too by drawing in all the lines in a horizontal manner. As I get closer to the shoreline, I get a little bit darker with it because that is where not only the reflections are, but also the cast shadows from the direction of the sunlight. As you can kind of see the sun over on the left-hand side of the pad, it's going from left to right. So are all the shadows casting across these forms. As I'm moving into the foreground, I'm being mindful of not crossing through the plants too much, or at least not crossing through them with such a dark line that it begins reducing the contrast or reducing the shape language of those foreground plants. In between, on the larger side, I am picking certain places to fill in between the fronds or the reeds and making sure that I don't cross over too many of them because I do, again, need to establish some kind of depth of field. Now going back over the top of all of the round lumps in the background, the trees themselves have multiple lumps to them. I'm very aware of this. Those bigger shapes, though, are the placeholder space for the entire tree to be built. And as long as I work with that contour line, I'll be able to keep the tree shape, and I'll stay true to my graphic design that I established early on with these lumps and bumps that are everywhere in the background. The fronds in the background fall along the arcs of the shapes. And as you can see here, I'm being very faithful to the big fluffy parts of those reeds. And as far as the centers go, and all of the different lines of each reed, I'm not drawing them with thickness, I'm drawing them with line. But the lines that are more important are the ones that are out at the edge first, the top edge. Then I'll come back into the centers and clean them up a little bit more. But the edge is the most important part because it's the part that defines the shapes behind it. That's the interactive part of the shape. So the boundaries first get the love. And then that allows me to build the trees down into those boundary lines, merging them together better, making them feel more cohesive altogether. Then the other parts that I'm concerned with are the ones that are spilling over towards us. I want to make sure that I identify some of those because it's really easy just to draw all the spikes sticking up in a rounded sort of way, but it's a spherical sort of way. Some of them are rounded towards our eyes. And the closer they get, the more prominent that kind of mark is going to be within those shapes. The further back things go, the more flat and graphic I can be with them. I'm also applying the shadow patterns at the same time that I'm applying the fronds. There's certain parts of each of those rounded lumps that have more definition because of the shadow patterns. And so I'm being very aware of that in placing them into those lump and bump shapes. Now, as I move over to the right side, I have just a few generic lines, but I'm going to break those lines up with small separate lumps like I've been doing elsewhere. But the further back they go, the more of them there are. And so it's really more about the hierarchy. Which ones are higher? Which ones are lower? Do they retain a rhythm? Do they maintain a flow? And how do they flow with each other? How do they all work together to join together and make this really beautiful symphony of shapes? Those reed plants in the background also make contact with the water, and it does get a lot darker, as I sort of did in the foreground with the reeds. I also want to make sure that that horizon line, or that ground line where the plants and the water meet each other, is very easy to identify. This is one of the only verticals in the picture. It's an important shape because it breaks up everything else Everything else is sort of rounded or radiating in their design forms. This gives us verticality and stability. Just like the water line gives us a calm and a place for us to actually tangibly touch down on the surface. That's also all the horizontal lines that are in the water. That firmly establishes ground plane. If you draw the ground plane with lines coming forward towards us, they're going to look more vertical or more diagonal, and they aren't going to feel as stable. The horizontal line is a stable line. The trees are growing upward, so when I shade them, I'm going to shade them vertically rather than horizontally. Eventually, I will throw in some horizontal shade lines, just to make sure that those lines don't only occupy the water, but they do sort of extend out like a gradation into some of the other spaces. I think that's really important. But the verticality for the trees, the horizontality for the water, gives us up and down and flat across. And that sort of helps establish the dimension of the space in our minds. Then there's the scale of the shapes. The reeds are the thing that you see in the foreground and in the background. So in the foreground, they have a little bit more detail built into them, while in the background, they're flat graphic shapes. Whatever shadow patterns I put on those shapes will hopefully help define their three-dimensional roundness. But more importantly, I'm really looking for wall, tall, so you look up as well as look down. I want you to be able to see the three-dimensional space. I'm also thinking about the range of values, and so some of the plants are not going to be filled in, while some of them will. Even though everything out in front of me is dark and green, it's about the graphic design now, and the ability for the eye to separate different planes in space. If I make everything exactly the same, depth of field is very difficult to achieve, especially with a ballpoint pen. As the trees get closer to the ground, I make them darker down there because that is making contact with the ground, but at the same time, other trees are casting shadows onto them, and this is the underside of the trees where light isn't reaching. Plus, that gradation really helps make for a good focal area and then atmosphere as we move away from the focal area. I'm kind of creating what you would call a vignette from both sides. I'm not drawing all the way out to the edge of the pad everywhere. I'm only doing that in a few places in the foreground. In the background, I'm finding some interesting shapes to break up the space, giving it a little bit of mystery, but also giving it a lot more focus within the center of the piece, where the eye should be, or where the eye should go, more specifically. Every time something disappears into the mess of halftones, I make sure to come back and reestablish those lines so that there is something solid for your eye to land upon. Here's where I'm starting to bring the horizontal lines up into the plants. I'm not doing it deliberately to shade things in. What I'm doing is creating a gradient that allows the technique that I use for the water to spread elsewhere so it doesn't feel isolated just in that one spot, but is shared amongst other parts of the picture, giving the picture a bit more cohesiveness altogether. And really now the only thing left to do is continue pushing down into the value range and then group things together by letting the shadow patterns cross over the forms from one another where they share shadows so that it starts to build a whole. It's not one shape, two shape, three shape, four. It's one picture with everything merging together. The reflections in the water are tricky too. What I'm doing with those is creating the same kind of shape in reverse as the plant, but then I'm shading around the outer edge of it to darken down the water a little bit more, hoping to show off the shapes as a slightly lighter shape on the water plane as a reflection, because I didn't take that into consideration when I first darkened the water down. As the sun is going down, it's revealing things in the reflections that weren't there before as prominent as they are at this point in the picture. Now in the foreground, because I put in so much noise in the background, I'm reestablishing the edges of all the reeds, the ducks, and I'm adding in little tiny details into the water as well that I didn't initially put in. Some of those little tiny details are just too soon. It wouldn't make any sense to have all of them in there at the very beginning. I would have been focusing too much on the foreground and not even been able to get to the background until several hours later, which I'm not going to do. I wanted to make sure that this thing was a fairly quick picture, but I do admit making it an 8.5 by 11 drawing, which is what the size of the paper is, did make it so that I had to work a little bit harder in order to get it finished in a timely fashion, because the larger you make the image, the more time you have to spend on it, especially if you're using a small device like the pen that I'm using here. So I know that I'm focusing on the figure in this series, but this is a show about art. And whenever I can, I'm going to sneak in these other little tidbits of information so that you can learn about other facets of art at the same time. I don't want sketching just to be its own special video that we see later on down the line. I'm going to be throwing that in every now and again. Maybe I'll throw some color studies in. Maybe I'll throw some concept art in. It's all up in the air right now. But because this is a show, I want to throw in just a little tiny bit of variety as well to keep all of you on point and keep you coming back for more, since you want to learn about everything. You want to be as well-rounded as possible as an artist. If you focus too much on just one thing, you'll get really good at it for sure, but you're also putting a lot of other things on hold at the moment, and there's no reason to do that. You should be able to do a number of different things all at the same time. Just plan your week out, plan your day out, and make sure that you give a little bit of time to each of these things that you're working on. That variety is going to help make the things that you're really focused on even more interesting, because all of these other tools add to your ability to see, which is what we're trying to learn how to do when we build our foundation. We're trying to learn how to use our eyes. All right. Thank you for watching all the way through on this one. And now let's get back to our regular scheduled program. Oh, and by the way, here's the finish.
Well, I hope you learned something today about applying the skeleton to the armature, and I hope it makes sense. Remember that the armature is a simplified tool for the artist, for us to be able to sketch, design, or illustrate with, or anything else for that matter that applies the figure to your art. In the next episode, we're going to be applying the muscles to the skeleton, and that should conclude the écorché portion of this 5-step process. Beyond that, we're going to be learning how to add tone to the figure and shade the figure, and I'm really looking forward to sharing that information with you. Don't forget that there's a Discord link below where we have a growing community of artists who are drawing together, sharing their information together, and learning together. It's a really great place. Also, don't forget that there's a Patreon page linked below, and that page has information that expands upon all the information that you watch within these videos. I can't put everything in these videos or they would take way too long. But also, I hope that you subscribe to that Patreon page where you're helping me build more of this kind of content for you to learn from. Thank you for coming in. Stay healthy, stay positive, and stay creative. Take care.